Hi, my name's Keith Cooper of Northlight Images, and I'm going to have a look today at my photography workflow. It's a question I get asked a lot about, and I'm going to look at not necessarily the finer details of every single step I do, but why I have a photography workflow, or more to the point, why I have different workflows depending on what it is I'm doing the photography for. Remember, I'm a commercial photographer, an architectural photographer, industrial photographer. So that means I have to produce pictures for people. Now, that's quite convenient in a way because it gives me a defined objective. A photography workflow is not something set in stone that one size fits all. So please, when you're looking at what I do, if you think, well, that doesn't mean anything to me, then good. If there's something doesn't mean, what does mean something to you? What is important to what you're doing? Photography workflow is, to me, a journey with a destination, and you need to know the destination to decide the best way of getting there. I have different destinations, as it were, depending on what sort of work I'm doing, whether I'm doing testing stuff for a video or for an article, whether I'm producing commercial print, or whether I'm producing commercial images which client is going to use on a website, brochures, things like that, or whether I'm just processing, I say just, processing a picture to make a pretty print to put on the wall that reminds me of something or has a use or something, whatever. But anyway, I run through all of these things, but right up front, think of, before you follow someone's advice and they goes, this is the workflow I suggest for landscape photography. Look at what it is they're trying to get out of it, why it is they're doing it the way they are. Now, the software choices I'm going to mention here are what I have used for years. That does not mean that I regard them as the best way of doing things for everybody else, which is ridiculous because, as I've said many times, I don't particularly like Lightroom, for example. Now, Lightroom offers all kinds of features aimed at making things easy for photographers. For myself, I don't like the catalogue concept of it, and its print handling is too much do everything for me. I don't have enough control over it. But then again, that's because I've specialised in printing and done lots of stuff. It may work for you. So whenever I suggest a piece of software that I use, think, why does Keith use this? Does this matter to me? Well, I prefer something else. Well, use something else. It's not about that. The key is understanding that it is a process that goes from perhaps even thinking about taking the photography through to whether it's a print, an image on the screen, or whatever you're going to be doing. So the things you might want to have, and I have different workflows for what I'm doing, kind of work I'm doing. Is it for print, web? Is it for work, paying work? Am I taking pictures just to document something? Just, for the fun of it? Because I do photography for the fun of it as well. Some of those photos appear in some of my testing, my reviews and that, others don't. Or is it for nothing much in particular other than just enjoying going out and taking some photos? Even that is perfectly fine. You don't necessarily need to know what you're going to be doing with the photos when you take them. I find it helps, but I do sometimes just go out and just for inspiration or something like that, go out and just take some photos. Now, what's the key element of that? Well, in camera settings, I'll always endeavour to shoot in RAW. One of the things I've discovered over the years is that keeping all my files in their original RAW format means that as software has improved, and it will, it changes, it improves over the years, the processing of images has changed and what you can get out of them has changed. So I can now take images I captured using my Canon 1DS back in 2004, for example, process those RAW files and do things with them and produce results that I simply could not have got in 2004, 5, 6, whatever, that I might have software has come in only in the last couple of years. Software will change, new software will come in, features will arrive, they may be of relevance to you, they may not. all the AI related stuff, being able to expand an image, being able to change it, that depends on what you want to do with the images. There is no reason that you might not want to change an image at all. It's entirely up to you. Depends what they're for. If I produce images for a client, an architectural client, and we use AI images to shove extra bits in, imagined buildings and stuff like that, I don't think they'd be terribly happy. Well, don't know, maybe they wouldn't care. That's a thing that's changing, something you need to have a think about perhaps. But when I'm looking at producing those images, I know where they're going to go. So I've got my raw camera shots. How do I get them off the card into the camera, into the computer? Now, I always process things on a computer. I have no place in this for tablets and other things like that. I'm just not interested for my workflow. However, you might need to get JPEGs off your camera onto a phone, send them somewhere, do all sorts of things with them. But that's for you to decide your process, your step by step, because you know what you want to do with those images. Doesn't mean you might not want to keep them at their highest, best quality as raw files for subsequent use, but you may just want to send them, use them on social media, whatever. But having an idea of what you want to do with your images and your options for that always helps, and that's a workflow, even if it's something relatively simple. If you're using a phone for capturing pictures, then you need to perhaps appreciate the quality limitations still, although they're getting better on phones, what you want to do with them. Are the pictures off the phones good enough for what you want? Well, if they're good enough, use that. Come up with your own work. That would be a wildly different workflow to anything I use here. I'm always generally aiming to maximize the quality of the original captured image, the raw file. Now, I take those off from a card, I put them on a computer, and I archive them. I archive them by date. Now, for me, for my commercial work, that means if I need to go back to the original work for a client, all I need to do is check the invoice for that client for that particular job. That will give me the exact date that the photos were taken, or period that the photos were taken, and I can go back and I can look at, and I'm just using Adobe Bridge here, which I've used for years. It suffices for what I want. I can find some pictures and I can open that in Photoshop or do whatever I want to do with them, or even just sort them out, find out whether I've got particular images. That's my filing system. Now, on import like this, you might decide that you want a more comprehensive catalogue of your images, a more comprehensive system of keywording and things like that. I don't, so I don't bother with that. Come to think of it, even if I thought of doing it now, after 20 years of being a commercial photographer, to the thought of going through and keywording several 100,000 images, it ain't going to happen. It was do I regret not doing it? No, because I'd never have got round to doing it. I'm not that sort of, I don't have that approach to my photography or things in general. I don't need things cataloguing and stuff like that. Maybe that's a problem, maybe not. If you want to catalogue all your images by date, location and things like that, look at software, asset management software, and various things like that you can do it. There's lots of it, but they can come in as part of your process of doing it at that state. It is much easier to catalogue stuff when you first get them in. And I'm sure, if I was starting again now, might I change it? I might. But then I know what I'm like, so would I stick with it? Probably not. Purely depends on what you want to do with your photos. Even if they're photos of nothing. I do catalogue to some, because I put them into categories and that for if I'm doing testing work. So I can find all the testing work I did with a particular lens, or when I was testing a particular printer or something like that. So all of that sort of stuff I can actually look at. So catalogue, that's an important thing if you want it. If you don't want it, it can just get in the way. Now, I've got Photoshop here, running here, and Adobe Bridge as well. Now, this is when I took the GFX 100 Mark II out. There's some of the test shots I've got for that. So I'm just looking at this. I'm just looking at the raw files here, just some pictures. there's nothing more I need to categorize these by other than knowing that they were taken on the GFX 100 Mark II. So they're images for that. If there was a particularly stunning image that I captured and I wanted to use for something else, I'd process that and use it for something else. But I'll mention that in a bit when we come down to editing and things like that. So I've got my images. They're raw files. In general, I want to process them. What am I going to use to process them? My default is Camera Raw on Photoshop because I use it a lot. I can open Camera Raw from Bridge here, and that may be useful depending on what I want to do with the images. Now, I've got, in terms of raw processing of software, I try different software all the time, but my default, my go-to is always Camera Raw. Now, there may be better options. Depends on what sort of lenses, cameras you use as to whether there are better options for you. I do have a copy of DxO. It's now Photolab, but I've had DxO Optics Pro for many years, right since it first started processing raw files. It has its limitations because it still doesn't support any of the high-end tilt shift lenses that I use for my work, so there are difficulties with it. But I do occasionally find images, particularly noisier images, higher ISO images, where the processing of it is markedly better and I can see it. So I may process some images. There's one other bit in a workflow, an emergency workflow I have. Twice in 20 years, I have gone out and done a job and not set the camera to take RAW and JPEG files. Normally I take both. The JPEGs are a bit of a backup just in case. Sometimes I use them, very rarely, but they're there. A couple of times I've gone on a job and for some reason, usually because I've been using the camera for macro photography or stacking or something like that, and I've left it set at JPEG only, I've gone out and I've taken a series of images of just JPEG images. Now, if they weren't well exposed and good images to start with, I'd really be in trouble. Fortunately, mostly the JPEGs in these two instances, and this is the sort of thing you only ever do once or twice and then you always remember it. I was able to process those JPEGs through DxO, get it to export as TIFF files. The TIFF files I'd exported, I could then process those as I wanted. Either I could re-import them into Camera Raw and use things like that, or I could process them some other way. But that's a sort of an emergency fallover. But it shows how there is a different, I'm getting to the same destination of using those images for a commercial project, but due to a mess up on my part, I've gone and taken them as JPEGs, so I have to make a slight detour on my journey. Fortunately, both times it was fine, and I was able to get perfectly good photos. Now, it helped with those photos because I took them at the maximum resolution of the camera, so either 50 megapixels or I did it once with the GFX 100S that I've got when I was getting used to it. Not an important job, but a job all the same. But the images were so good at 100 megapixel coming out of that, but the time I supplied them to the client at, let's say, 4,000 pixels resolution across, they looked fine. Nobody was going to notice. I could tell, if I looked very carefully at some of them, that I'd had to use JPEGs. But yeah, I don't think anyone else is going to notice. And that's the key bit, because these are commercial photographs. They are for a purpose. They are for the client. So I know what the client wants them for. I know what will suffice. So I've got a workflow that goes through taking pictures, processing them basically, and sending them off as JPEGs to a client. Now, because I know this particular route, the quality constraints aren't nowhere near as high as if I'm going through making specific images for print or something like that. That's where I really do need the capacities of the camera. But the same workflow applies. I go through importing, take them in RAW, import them into the computer. They are archived by date, but they're processed as the RAW files, and they go through. Now, I might process these, produce them, just run through. You'll see here, you're thinking maybe, well, that's a lot of faffing about. What about if you've got lots of images? Now, here's one of the bits where I said you need to know what your destination is and what's going to be at that destination. I don't shoot weddings, for example, so I don't have the issue of maybe having 2,000 photos that I've snapped away on a wedding, over the day of a wedding and things like that. And I've got loads and loads of photos. I've got to cull that lot. Now, it may be at the import stage in the initial processing, you want to do some culling of the photos and assign it, but you still may end up with a lot of photos. And if you're doing this regularly, you end up with lots of photos. Now, for me, a job that I go on that I come back with 100 photos is a lot. It's not uncommon for me to do a job and come back with 20, 30 photos. Now, I may have taken a few more, but the client is not expecting any more than a few photos. So that's my destination. I know the destination is producing a dozen photos. Now, I prefer to take more and maybe give the client, if they're okay with it, the options of picking which ones they like for further processing. But in general, I don't do jobs with hundreds and hundreds of photos. So I did do a job a few years ago where I ended up taking 600 or 700 pictures or something. Fascinating job, not one I do at all often, but yeah, I enjoyed it and I had a lot of editing to do afterwards. So for that, I can't remember what program. I used the same process. I just took longer looking at it, in working over it. It wasn't a rush job, so I didn't have to get them done the next day or anything like that. So that was all sorted and that was okay. But see, it can change. Your workflow can vary depending on what you're doing. If you are producing pictures for competitions or something like that, you might want to have something which addresses that at the end. So I've said I've got to the point where I've got all the pictures in here. I'll open them up. I may process them via ACR and just export them as JPEGs to send off to a client, if that's okay for it, whatever settings are required, whatever color space. But for individual images, what's my workflow after I've done that? Well, I'll import them into Photoshop. Now, once I've got them in Photoshop, obviously I'm only working at one image at a time. Now, I can do scripting and things, and I can set up options to process a lot of images with known settings and various things. That's a bit more work. It's something I don't do very often these days because I don't do, let's say, large numbers of pictures. But let's say I pull in a picture, an individual picture. I'm going to edit that. Now, part of that, the editing, let's say, depends on how many pictures I'm doing. But let's just say I'm doing a picture here, and both of these are pictures, one from an industrial job, capturing in a foundry. Now, this one, I took lots of photos here because things like sparks and things like this, you can't predict it. You just have to take quite a few pictures and look for the one where the sparks make the best pattern. There's an element of chance in shots like this. The picture here, I had a few. This is a picture of the fire headquarters for Leicestershire. I took several. The flag was fluttering away there. This is taken on a mast at about 5-6 meters height to get the perspective looking well. Taken with a shift lens as well, but I took several photos there because the flag was fluttering about, and I just wanted one that you could actually read the whole flag. So I'm not just taking one picture, I'm just taking, so I've got a lot. I've picked the one picture in each instance that I want to work on. Depending on what I'm going to do with those pictures, I will edit them to varying degrees. Now, that may, if I'm making a print, so here's a print made of a commercial image. Now, this particular image has made me, it's one of my most successful images in terms of profitability. Why is it? Because it was an image that was so widely stolen that it provided, and still does, an ongoing income source from copyright infringements. For some reason, this is a picture of Leicester Station. For some reason, it gets stolen, because that's what it is, and used by companies without any thought of the fact. Now, the web version has my name on it. Now, that gets removed. That costs them more money. But this was originally sent as a web image. I then produced this as a print. Now, I use it as part of my my collection, of part of my portfolio of architectural style images. It happens to be one that signifies Leicester Station, works very well. Now for that, I've gone through, I've resized it, I've sharpened it for print. Now, that can involve different bits of software. Depends what you're happy with. So resizing, I may use Gigapixel AI. If I'm using Gigapixel AI, I have to export the image and process it separately. If I'm using Sharpen AI from Topaz, which I use sometimes for shifted images, then I can do that in Photoshop. The precise, but I know the key for this is always I know where I'm going on that journey of the workflow. So I'm looking at that. What about if I've got a picture like this that I might want to produce at different sizes? Well, I will just save a master Photoshop document with layers, any other adjustments inside it. I don't use non-destructive editing at all. I save layers. I've been using Photoshop for years, so I'm comfortable with using adjustment layers, master adjustment layers, all sorts of things like that. It just works. I save it in whatever format I want. Now, if you're using something like Lightroom, where all the edits and everything are stored in data for the file, you might want to export it as a TIFF at some stage if you have like a master version for something. Now, I will produce, for something I know I'm going to be doing for prints, I may well produce several master versions of it at different sizes. They may be set for print, in which case if they've been sharpened and they're print ready images, the file name I'll also include in it, the size and a letter P in it to say that this has been sharpened for print, and not to open it up in 2 or 3 years time think, oh, this needs sharpening, sharpen it up and do it, because double sharpening can cause problems. Now, it may be that if the file is old enough, that software has changed enough that I will go back to that raw file that I produced and archived and reprocess that raw file, because it may be I can get quicker, better results by processing a file from scratch again with modern software than I can by taking a 10, 15-year-old Photoshop file, processing that and looking at it. May just be better. Depends purely on the file. But once again, the whole key thing is that I have an objective as to why I'm doing it. The process may have changed from when I had produced that original PSD file, but the destination, the print, has changed. It will have changed anyway, just because I'm using possibly, almost certainly, a different printer. So things need processing differently for a printer. So I may have a particular general workflow for producing prints on this, the Epson P5000 here, which is different to the workflow I would have had. And here's an old print I pulled out of the archives. And here is a print, an image I took in 2004, if I remember rightly. I'll try not to get too many reflections on it there. That's the Wind River. That's in Wyoming. And now that black and white image, this was printed, and I can tell from the slight bronzing and the type of paper it is, this was printed on an Epson 9600 large format printer. It looks fine. The image itself I'm happy with, but the amount of bronzing that is visible on it, it's not strong, but it is, I can see it here with the lights reflecting off it. I would go back either to the original image if it was good enough, but more than likely, since this was taken with a Canon 1DS and this is an 11 megapixel source file, I would go back to that original file and I would find it. How would I find this particular image? Well, it's not a commercial image, so I would have to know where it was taken, and I would have to know roughly during the time I spent driving around, Colorado and Wyoming in 2004, I would need a rough idea of when. I could find it quite quickly looking at the archive, because the archive is by date, so I could pretty quickly work out where I was and when I took this. I would process it again, I would go back to the raw file, and I could comfortably produce a good looking image. Mind you, this one's not bad, given, as I say, this is produced often. This is printed quite a few years ago. I wouldn't have had the sharpening and processing software that I have now. So looking at this one again, and I've genuinely not looked at this print for several years, yeah, it doesn't look too bad. But what worked then may not work now. So your workflow will change over time. Your workflow is something I like to look at every time somebody asks me to look at some new bit of software. I will look at it and think, does this change how I might want to process things? Because remember, the destination of that journey hasn't changed. You're just offering me a slightly different route, or you're giving me a different car to make the journey in. It's a difference like that. So all of it depends. Workflow is important. It is not set in stone. And that's the key bit. Be prepared to change your workflow if you find something that works better for you. That's why if somebody goes, here is such and such workflow, by all means work with it. Now, I'm not a recipe follower. My nature is not to go to write things. It's why you don't get step-by-step guides for me doing stuff on Photoshop and things like that. Because the answer is always, it depends. There are a number of ways. The key is knowing the destination, not necessarily the exact road you're going to take to get there. That's just the way I see things. Now, I know some people find it easier to have a process that says you do this, you do that, and poof, out comes at the end, out comes a print. Now, to me, I'm thinking, well, yeah, that might work once, but it might not work so well for that. So there's a degree of flexibility in it. All depends on what works for you. Now, I appreciate a lot. There are people who do not like that. I mean, it's the same. I enjoy cooking. I use recipes as no more than initial inspiration for them, and then I will work out to whatever, because the destination, i.e. the dish at the end, is what I'm after. I'm not bothered about it. So it means I'm not the greatest of bakers, because I'm not someone who carefully follows recipes, which you need for baking much more than you do for normal cooking. I'm a cook, not a baker. Subtle difference there. If you know what I mean by that, you'll see it immediately. But the key is always, my workflow is what works for me. Hopefully some aspects of it may help inform your own choice of workflow. If you want to go the Lightroom route, then great. I may not like it. Likewise with Capture One, I may not like the software because of the workflow choices that are made in that, but that doesn't mean it won't work for you. So have a think about what it is, what works for you. If cataloguing and being able to find a precise photo from a search term is important, then make sure that you do that as part of your workflow. If it doesn't matter, then don't beat yourself up about it. Anyway, I hope that's of some interest and that it makes sense. And it goes some of the way towards asking people who ask me, how do I arrange my photos and stuff? One last little bit, how do I arrange my prints? Well, not very well, as you'll probably guess, actually. It depends what they're there for. Some of the better prints I have, this is actually a map chest, map drawers, this table here, very solid table, has the drawers in this go all the way to the back. They are huge drawers and they are full of stuff. 2 drawers in this are full of prints interleaved with sheets of tissue paper. Why I keep them, I'm still not entirely certain. Sometimes I have a clear out every so often, and there you go. Which is one of the reasons why I was looking at this particular print here and thinking, not looked at that picture for a while. So that's the other thing. Go through your archive every so often. Try and work out why you took something. If you can't work out why you took a picture, well, stop and have a think about it. Look at the other pictures. There may be pictures that you glossed over, never thought of at the time, but in going back to them, maybe with different software, you think they're great. Anyway, if you've got any questions, please do let me know. Always appreciated. And thanks for watching. Cheers.